In the first module, we had this economy that consisted of wheat and computer production, but we only had one producer. So in this lecture, we're going to extend that some and say that there's two countries. There's the US, who has 50,000 labor hours. It takes 100 hours of labor to produce one computer, and 10 hours for 1 ton of wheat. And now we'll also consider Japan, who has 30,000 labor hours. And it takes Japan 125 hours per computer and 25 hours per ton of wheat. So there's our setup. And we can draw some production possibilities frontiers for these two economies. So we know from the first module that, right, we've already done the calculations for the US. We know if we devote all our labor to wheat, we'll get 5,000 tons. And if we devote all our labor to computers, we'll get 500 computers. And so we can connect those points and get our PPF. And for Japan, we can do the same thing, right? 30,000 hours divided by 125 hours per computer gives us 240 computers. And doing the same for wheat tells us that we can do 1,200 tons of wheat. And we can plot those. So we've got 1,200 about here, 240, and connect those. Now let's say in a self-sufficient world that the United States decides to split their labor half and half. Half to computers, half to wheat, which means we're going to get 2,500 tons of wheat and 250 computers. And let's also assume Japan splits half and half, which means we're going to get 600 tons of wheat from Japan and 120 computers. So at this point, we've said nothing about trade, right? All of these allocations and outcomes are possible without trade. So let's quickly plot the outcome here in our table. We've got 250 computers for the US and 2,500 tons of wheat, and 120 and 600 for Japan. So here's our baseline. If both of these countries are going to be self-sufficient, this is one possible bundle of output that could be generated. So our question we want to answer here is how does consumption in the no trade situation compare to consumption when trade is considered? Now let's say that trade is available and the US decides that they're going to allocate 34,000 labor hours to wheat production and the remaining 16,000 hours for computers. And so that's going to allow them to produce 3,400 tons of wheat and 160 computers. In the case of Japan, let's say they spend all 30,000 labor hours and make computers. So they're right here. And now let's assume some trading takes place. So the US is going to export 700 tons of wheat to Japan, and they are going to import 110 computers from Japan. So the US gains 110 computers. So they've got 270 computers, and they gave up 700 tons of wheat. So they're now at 2,700 tons of wheat and 270 computers, which is actually outside of their production possibilities frontier, right? And we can quickly verify that mathematically. 2,700 tons of wheat times 10 hours is 27,000 hours of labor, and 270 computers times 100 hours is also 27,000 labor hours. So this allocation here requires 54,000 labor hours, and we know they only have 50,000. So this is not a point they could have gotten to without trade. In the case of Japan, they were producing 240 computers and exported 130 or 110 of them. And so they have 130 left, and they imported 700 tons of wheat. Which is out here. And again, we can verify that this is outside of their production possibilities frontier. 700 times 25, right? 25 is the labor hours that Japan needs for wheat. And right, 125 for the 130 computers. So 17,500 for wheat. And 16,250 for computers, or 33,750 total labor hours for this point. So in both instances, each of these countries is now producing outside their production possibilities frontier, which we know for a self-sufficient economy is not possible. However, with trade, that's a reality. So we know from the previous slide, the US was getting 250 computers, 2,500 tons of wheat. Japan was consuming 120 computers and 600 tons of wheat. And if we compare that to these values, So we've got without trade, with trade, and we've got computers and wheat. So without trade, the US had 250 computers. With trade, they got 270. So we've got a gain of 20 computers. In wheat, they were at 2,500. Now they're at 2,700. So a gain of 200. And then we can do the same thing for Japan. They had 120 computers before. Now they have 130, or plus 10 computers and 600 tons of wheat. They now have 700, so plus 100. So as we can see, they're gains from trade in this case, right? The total of which is the sum of all these. In total, we got 30 extra computers and 300 tons of wheat that was not possible without trade.